All right, the next part of this course, we're going to be focusing on word stress. Word stress we can think of as the accent or the emphasis in a word. So if we have a word with multiple syllables, we need to know which syllable is the one that is accented or stressed. So in many languages, we actually have accents that are accent marks that tell us where to put the emphasis in a word. If you're a Spanish speaker, we have the tildes that let us know where to emphasize in a word, what syllable is emphasized. In English, we don't have these, but we do have some rules. Again, in English, there are always exceptions to the rules. With word stress, the best way to go about this is to just listen to the language as much as you can and kind of get a feel for the rhythm. Stress we can think of kind of as, like I said, the rhythm of a language. A language is kind of like music, right? Each language sounds different, it has its own rhythm, intonation, and that's how we can kind of get used to the stress in English. So there are some rules that we will talk about, but again, the best way to practice this is just by listening to the language, to the radio, movies, anything like that, and then copying, repeating. First of all, in English, only one word can only have one stress. Sometimes we have a secondary stress in a word that isn't as strong, but generally speaking, a word only has one stress, okay? And we have to think of words, we have to break them down into different syllables, right? So if we have the word develop, we can clap out the syllables, right? Develop. Develop. We have 3 syllables. So one of these syllables is going to have the stress. Usually if we hear the word, we can think of it develop, right? We can hear that our intonation is raising with that second syllable. Develop. It's not develop and it's not develop, right? It's develop. So usually by hearing a word and thinking of when or where our intonation is rising, that's when we know where the stress is within a word. And we can kind of play around with it to figure out which sounds correct. Again, if we have the word develop, we can think, okay, is it develop? Is it develop? Or is it develop? So we can play around with the stress and kind of hear or feel which one sounds right based on what we've heard in the past. So, again, we kind of can think of a language as music. We need to get a feel for the rhythm of the language, the intonation, all of those components. So, again, we will talk about some of the rules with stress, and it's good to know these rules. However, some of the rules get a little complicated. They might be difficult to remember. And they have a lot of exceptions. So definitely keep that in mind as we go through these rules and these words. So one of the first rules, this one is pretty easy to remember. If we have a 2-syllable noun, so most 2-syllable nouns and most 2-syllable adjectives, our stress is going to be on the first syllable. Okay? For example, in the word present, right? It's not present because that would be a different word. Spelled exactly the same, but the change in the stress in this instance, in this example, changes the meaning of the word. So here we have present, right? I have a present for you. I have a present for you. Next is export. Exports. We need to analyze the exports. China. China. She took a trip to China. Table. Table. The book is on the table. Right? Same thing goes for adjectives, 2-syllable adjectives, or most 2-syllable adjectives. We have the word slender. Slender. She is very slender. Clever. Clever. The children are very clever. Happy. Right? It's not happy, but happy. Happy. We are so happy to see you. With most two-syllable nouns and most two-syllable adjectives, the stress is going to be on the first part of the word, the first syllable of the word. If we look at two-syllable verbs, it's going to be the opposite. So most two-syllable verbs, the stress is going to be on the second syllable. And that's where we can differentiate present versus present. So if we say present, it's a noun or an adjective. If we say present, it's a verb. Same exact word, spelled exactly the same, but the change in stress is going to change the meaning of the word as well. There are some words in English that are like this. Not all of them have a noun or adjective and verb equivalent, but some do, and we'll go over those as well. Something else to point out here is with the schwa sound. Remember, the schwa sound is the sound that a vowel makes when it is not stressed. So if we have, for example, with the word decide, it's D-E, but we're not really saying decide, and we're not saying decide. It's turning into the schwa sound, decide. All right, so pay attention to that as well whenever we're talking about stress. The vowels that are not stressed usually are going to turn into the schwa sound. So let's go back through some of these two-syllable vowels. Present. Again, we can hear that schwa sound, right? It's not like the noun where it's present. Export. Decide. Begin. Right? So these two-syllable verbs, the stress is going to be on the second part. Let's listen to these in sentences. I have to present my ideas tomorrow. They decided to export those goods. We always decide where to eat. Class is going to begin soon. All right, so let's take a look at some more words that are the same, spelled exactly the same, but depending on if they're a noun or adjective or a verb, they change stress. For example, we have the word record. Right? It's a noun. Record. She collects vinyl records. Or he broke a world record. So we have that stress on the first part and it's a noun. What if we change the stress to the second part? Record. Can you record the TV show for me? I'm going to record this video. And again, we can hear that the E is not pronounced the same as if it were a noun, record. When it changes to a verb, that E changes to that schwa sound too, record. What about the word contrast? This can be a noun or an adjective. Contrast. There's a huge contrast between these two colors. If we want to turn it into a verb, it's going to sound like contrast. Let's compare and contrast these ideas. And we notice that O is also turning into that schwa sound, contrast. What about desert? Right? They traveled to the Sahara Desert. If we put the stress on the second part, it's going to sound like dessert. not like dessert that you eat, but the action to desert or to be deserted. Desert. Let's see, what about objects? An object. There were many objects in the store. What happens when we turn this to a verb? Object. Object. The judge objected. Object versus object. One of my favorite ones here, we have produce. Produce. As a noun or an adjective, this refers to fresh fruits and vegetables, right? We might see this at the grocery store, the produce section of the grocery store, where all the fruits and vegetables are. If we turn this to a verb, of course, it's produce. Produce. They're producing a new line of makeup. So produce, produce. And again, we can hear that schwa sound, produce. All right, so these are just a couple of examples of words that are spelled exactly the same, but the stress changes depending on if they're a verb or a noun, and that's how we differentiate the meaning of the word, right? Because produce sounds quite different from produce. Produce, produce. All right, let's look at some other examples here. So now these rules with stress are going to get a little more complicated. First, we have words where the stress falls on the second to last syllable, the penultimate syllable, the second to last syllable. And these are going to be words that have the suffix. Remember, a suffix is a group of letters that goes at the end of a word to change the root word meaning, to change the meaning of the word in some way. So if a word has the suffix ik, I-C, or shun with S-I-O-N or T-I-O-N, then the stress is usually going to fall on the second to last syllable, usually. Right? Remember, in English, there are many exceptions, so usually. Let's look at the word graphic. Graphic. What if we added on a prefix and a suffix to this word to make it a little bit longer? Geographic. Geographic. All right? What about geologic? Geologic. So we can hear that the stress is falling on the second to last syllable. So the syllable before the ik, right? Geographic, geologic. Let's look at our shun words. We have revelation. The next one is debatable, depending on who you're talking to. Some people put the stress on the second to last syllable, while some people do not. We have television. Television. Sometimes you will hear people say television. Television. So that one is debated within the English world. So some people will say television, and some people will say television. All right, our rules are getting even more complicated here. So now we're looking at the suffixes such as C with CY, T with TY, phi and G. So PHY and GY, all of these suffixes that have a Y at the end. And also words with the suffix al, al. So with these suffixes, if we have a word with any of these suffixes, then the stress is going to be on the third to last syllable. Okay, you might be thinking, if I'm talking, how am I going to think of the word and then count all of the syllables and figure out where it goes? Of course. So that's what I'm saying, that with stress, it's something that we kind of get used to just from listening to the language, practicing, repeating, not necessarily by memorizing these rules. It is good to know these rules, of course, but just practicing using these words in sentences and listening. So let's look at some of these words here. We have democracy. Democracy. Democracy was established in the United States years and years and years ago. Dependability. Dependability. Okay? Dependability. Dependability is an important trait to look for in a person. Let's go to photography. Photography. Some people tend to say photography, so we want to make sure that our stress is on that ta, photography. And again, we can hear the schwa sound in pho, photography. It's not photography, photography. She decided to study photography. Geology. Geology. Geology is the study of rocks. Critical. Critical. Right? Critical. It is critical that you wash your hands before eating. Next is geological. Geological. They were interested in that geological phenomenon. All right. Let's go to some compound words. So it's one word, but there are two words within that word. Okay? So for compound nouns, the first part is going to be stressed. For example, blackbird. So it's one word, it's all together, but we have two different words in here, blackbird, and that's why it's called a compound word. Blackbird. Blackbird is my favorite song by the Beatles. Greenhouse. Greenhouse. They built a greenhouse in their yard. We also have compound adjectives. Usually compound adjectives are written with a dash in between them. So two words, but we have a dash in between them. And the second part is going to be stressed. So for example, bad-tempered. Bad-tempered. He is bad-tempered. He gets mad at the smallest things. Old-fashioned. Old-fashioned. Her style is very old-fashioned. And of course, we have compound verbs. Not too many of them, but we do have some, such as understand. Can you hear where the stress is? Understand. Right? It's on the last part. It's going to be on the second part. Understand. Overflow. I don't understand. Again, with stress, this is something that we notice and acquire after listening to the language, practicing, repeating native speakers, whether it's during a radio show, a movie, a TV show, anything like that. So, what I'll encourage you all to do now is go back through this section of the course and practice. So again, whenever we're practicing with this course, we want to repeat everything that is said, the words, the sentences, the examples, and record ourselves. That's the most important. When we notice that there's a word that we're struggling with, or we notice that it's not quite how it should sound, we want to practice that word over and over and over again in different sentences. And we're going to do that every single day for at least 2 weeks. So go ahead and go back through this video, practice with all of these words and sentences, record yourself, and see where you need to improve.